Again, my name is Jess Alvarez-Parfrey, Program Director with Transition US. I'm really excited to greet you all. We're going to have a fantastic session today. This is our Just Transition Plenary. It is my pleasure to welcome our panelists. I'm going to begin with Ana Rosa Rizo Centino, Executive Director of One Step a la Vez. I'm going to introduce Gopal Dayaneni from Movement Generation. I'm also going to acknowledge the wonderful David Cobb coming to us from Cooperation Humboldt up in Northern California. Gopal's in the Bay Area. Ana Rosa on the Central Coast. Also want to do some geographic locating here. And then we have Michelle Vassal, Tribal Administrator for the Wiyot community, coming to us from Northern California as well. And then it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alfredo Carlos, Executive Director for the Foundation for Economic Democracy, who will be moderating our session today. Over to you, Alfredo. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Jess, for that introduction. And I want to welcome everybody who's joining us and taking time on their Sunday afternoon to have a really, hopefully, thriving conversation. Before we get started, I want to sort of frame the session a little bit. I think this is the reason I agreed to do this is because I think it's important to have a conversation about where we're going. And so as I get into asking our panel a bunch of awesome questions, and hopefully we're going to have a great dialogue, one of the things that I sort of am reminded on is where, at what point did I go from trying to be critical and trying to understand the conditions of, society and my community specifically, to trying to envision something new. And I think that's what this sort of not just this plenary, but the summit is actually really about. And I remember being in college and being, against racism and being against capitalism and extraction and being against oppression in general, and doing a lot of social justice work, being involved in, the Santa Barbara community, trying to fight, for the little people, the people who kind of get dispossessed and displaced. And I got frustrated that, we were always fighting against things. We were always sort of reacting to what, was being done to us. And I remember having a moment where I was a truancy case manager, working with truant students. And I was thinking, like, they don't need me. They need resources. They need, their families need, to have better jobs. Their families they don't need somebody to fund my position to do like back end work. We need front end sort of change. We need to change the conditions of people so that they don't need me. And I remember having that clear thought. And that's when I really began to sort of explore, like, what does that look like? So I went to grad school and I started thinking, and that's why I developed the Foundation for Economic Democracy. And that's what I teach about this stuff is, can we have really interesting conversations with really bright and talented people about what the future looks like, not just what we're against, but what are we for? And so I'm really excited for us to be having this conversation because there's so much amazing work out there. And I think one of the things that I've learned is that there isn't one thing, right? Like that one thing that I'm looking for is not one. There's so many multitudes of awesome, amazing projects that are going on. And we're really looking forward to having people join us and grow those different projects. Democracy requires that it look different in different places, depending on different contexts. And so what I'm going to start out with is, if I can have the panelists respond to a similar question, what is your earliest memory moment of knowing that you were going to help change the world in the same light, not just, we're going to fight against and we're going to fight for the people that need fighting, because we need to do that, right? I'm not saying that, we need to stop doing that work. That work's important. We need to protect the most vulnerable in our communities. But when was the moment you said, what, I want to envision something new. I want to work on developing where we're headed. Not just tearing down the thing that's oppressing us. So I don't know if we want to start with maybe, like, I don't know if y'all want to volunteer. I'm not very totalitarian, so I have a hard time telling people what to do. But does any one of our panelists want to jump on that question? When was the first moment that you realized you wanted to do envisioning and looking to the future and building out, where we're headed? Okay, I'll go with Ana Rosa.
Hi, everyone. I would say my earliest memory was when I was a young child and I realized that my mom had to have 3 jobs in order to have our family be able to live in our apartment and have food. I just didn't understand why I hardly had a chance to see her, and why she, instead of having one job where she has a livable, sustainable wage, why she had to work three and be on her feet all day and be so exhausted by the time she got home. That was my earliest memory. And also being in lines with her when she was getting her naturalization, crazy word to describe that. And the way that people would look at her when she would speak, English with an accent. And when I had to translate for her as a 5-year-old, I'm like, why can't things just all be in different languages? Why is English the main language that everyone has to succumb to and abide by? And so really it was my family and growing up a working class Chicana, and knowing that it was wrong to be living that way. And so when I got the opportunity to organize with the farm workers as a college student, it was the perfect entry to have really that critique of capitalism and to be able to fight for farm workers to have a livable existence with dignity and respect.
Thank you, Ana. I'm just gonna go ahead and take my leadership role, I guess. I'm gonna go with let's go with David.
So, well, thank you so much, Alfredo. And Ana Rosa, I'm so glad that you started where you did, because in my head was one of my earliest memories. I guess I'm 4 or 5 years old in this memory. And, I used to be ashamed to say this, but I grew up not working class, but in poverty. Like, as in we didn't, now, rural poverty is different than urban poverty, but we didn't have a flush toilet, right? So, like rural poverty is probably a little better than urban poverty, but it still sucks. But I was blessed because I know that I was surrounded by love and compassion and kindness, and I knew that there was a place in the world for me, right? And that, I think, is the birthright of every human being. And it's so shitty that we live in a capitalist economy that prevents that from folks. But to answer your question, Alfredo, the memory goes like this. I'm 4, maybe 5. I'm with my brother and my cousin, Joe Michael. That's right, I'm from rural Texas, and most of my cousins have 2 names. Anyway, we're fighting over a little toy. It's like a little Matchbox toy, something like that. I don't remember what it was, but I remember this. We're yelling and fighting, and I remember my mama comes in the room, and she doesn't stay over us, although she towers over us, right? We're little kids. She gets down, crouches down. I remember she puts her hands on us and she very gently just talks to us, right? And says, shh, wait, what's going on? What's going on? What is it? There's a disagreement over this one toy. Oh, and there's 3 of you. This is the problem. There's 3 of you and only one of these. But look, she said, look at all these things I've seen you play with. And she literally just starts to grab things and pulls them into the circle. And she says, look, there's enough. Like you can share, or if you really have to have this, then you just have to share it. First Joe Michael, then Keith, then Ty, right? She said, there's enough to go around. All you have to do is share. And damn it, that made sense to me as a 4-year-old. It makes sense to me now. There's enough to go around. All we have to do is share. And Alfredo, I'm now going to take that into my young adulthood. November of 1999, I'm on the streets of Seattle, Washington. Tear gas in the streets. Go, Paul, you probably were there, I'm guessing, right? And I remember shouting, whose streets? Our streets. Whose streets? Our streets. I'll be honest, I've shouted that a bunch of times, but I remember specifically shouting, whose streets? Our streets. Whose streets? Oh, fuck. They are our streets. We had literally taken the city, and I'm getting goosebumps just telling the story. I had this, collectively, if we actually go beyond protest, if we assert ourselves, they are our streets. We could do the whole thing differently. So those are my 2 answers. I cheated and gave you 2 answers to your 1 question.
It's fine. It's fine. It's all one story, right? No, that's really a beautiful thing. And I remember being in college when, like, being new to a lot of this stuff. I grew up with the American dream. I'm not gonna lie. I wanted to, be a businessman. I want to take care of my family, like all the stuff that that's how hegemony works, right? You grow up with this vision of what the world should be and it's really individualistic. And then I saw that, and I saw I had read about the Zapatistas, and I was like, okay, there's these people who are doing things differently. And I got really curious with that. So I really want to commend y'all's work, because y'all sort of, started a lot of pushing in that direction. All right, I'm going to go with Michelle. If you can also jump in with this question, and just what started the process for you?
I can't say that I guess I just kind of grew up in a world of around extended family, and we all just grew up with this idea that you helped out. It didn't matter who you were, you jumped in and helped out whenever somebody needed something. And as a kid, I grew up in a family that had a lot of aunts, a lot of cousins, grandparents, great grandparents, and we interchanged to, like, my mother is my mother, but her sisters were also my mother, and my grandparents were also my mother. And like Anna said, I grew up with, my parents worked really hard, and I grew up at my mother's feet, and where she worked. I just grew up working with her. But I think, that kind of carried into my adulthood, that idea that you always help out and you always are, working and helping out when is needed. And when I got into college, I got sucked into just other mentors who kind of brought me up in that same way. They weren't my family, but they were extended as though they were my family, and kind of picked me up and helped me to see a brighter future, or a better way. And I just kind of got taken along at that path, as though this is like normal, that you're just supposed to be working together towards a better future.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm hearing some similarities. I'm hearing a lot of family values in here, and as I sort of think about, I always had a sort of a cognitive dissonance. We're not understanding that the values that we teach children, and then the values that we're supposed to adapt to as adults, are being like vastly different. Like cooperation and sharing as a kid, but then individualism and selfishness as an adult. Like that is an emotional disconnect that I feel a lot of people actually don't understand and don't know how to manage. So thank you all for your stories. Gopal, your turn.
Yeah. Before I tell my story, I just wanted to say that what you just said, Alfredo, made me reminded me of one of my parenting mantras. My kids are teenagers now, but I live in an intentional community with 4 other families, and have raised my kids in community my whole life. And one of the things that I reflect on a lot is this idea that you do not teach values. You cannot teach values to your kids. You can only live values. And if you do not live the values you espouse, the only value you teach is hypocrisy. And so the idea of living into our values, I think, is a really important principle that I think you're speaking to right from the start. So just wanted to say that, because it landed on what you were saying. I just wanted to say really quickly, my name is Gopal, and I use he, him pronouns, and I live in Huchin, which is unceded Chochenyo Ohlone territories. I live along the Temescal Creek watershed. This is also one of the birthplaces of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, Oakland, California. And I live in an intentional cooperative community of organizers and educators. And I mentioned that also, and I wanted to do the land acknowledgement also to say anybody who lives in my area should actually be involved in the Segorte Land Trust, which is the Ohlone land trust to rematriate land in the Bay Area. And there is a Shumai land tax. This is a tax that we can and should be paying to support rematriation of land to the Ohlone peoples, which to me is an important part of the vision of doing the right thing that we're talking about here. So I just wanted to start there. I'm similar to other folks in terms of the whole value, how I was raised question. Although I grew up in the suburbs of Silicon Valley. I come from a family of peasant farmers from Southeast India who grew food going back generations, and it was only through the Green Revolution and the influx of cash crops and chemicals that converted my family from peasant farmers to mining for calories and extracting wealth from the soil. And that extraction of wealth created the cash that got my dad an education and landed me in the suburbs of Silicon Valley, or in Silicon Valley. And I remember growing up, if my mother saw somebody wearing a sari anywhere, like in the grocery store or something, she'd like run up to them and like try every language she knew to try. And I grew up in this idea of like being home meant being in community with other Indians, or actually more broadly South Asians at that time. Now, of course, where my parents live, where I grew up, yeah, I hear more Telugu being spoken in the grocery store than English. There's so many, and people have, over time, we got into more smaller communities by language, by region. But I grew up with this very, very deep commitment to like, we are a community, we care for each other, we look out for each other, we share food. My dad would get multiple garden plots, community garden plots, and then divide up all the produce. He still does that. And then, when I was a teenager, I went to India after high school. I was kind of a troubled kid in high school. So my parents sent me off to India after high school. And I remember getting off the plane and having these two simultaneous realizations. And the first was like, holy shit, everybody looks like me. I hadn't really put that together before, that I lived in a world in which most people didn't look like me. And I was like, holy, every single person looks like me. And then I also suddenly realized almost simultaneously this idea that, yeah, and every single thing I have comes at the expense of somebody who looks exactly like me. And it sent me on this journey of this line of inquiry around trying to understand the interconnectedness of those relationships over time and how that played out in my life and how that continues to play out. And another little piece of the story for me is also in the early 90s, during the first Iraq War, the first Gulf War, Desert Storm. I remember I was a college student, and I remember being at a big rally and a bunch of people, and it's like somebody who I thought was like a middle-aged white environmentalist, who's probably only like 15 years older than me at the time. Now I'm middle-aged, I realized he wasn't that old. But anyway, he was like getting everybody chanting "No blood for oil," and I was going to go next, and I was going to give some, I was going to talk about how people of color are cannon fodder and all of that, and which is all true, of course. But I realized that there was something really true about "No blood for oil," but something also missing. And I went up and I said, we shouldn't be saying "No blood for oil." We have to be saying "No blood or oil," because where there's oil, there has to be bloodshed. There is no other way to get it. And I think for me, that was also part of the journey of like, okay, everything about everything is death dependent. And we need to find another way to live and be. And so that for me is, I think, part of that journey. And movement generation, we say what the hands do, the heart learns, because if all we do is fight against what we don't want, we will learn to love the fight. And that's not good enough. That leaves nothing for our vision but longing. And longing will not get us to where we need to be. We have to live into the world we know we need. So that to me is at the heart of it.
That's actually an excellent point for my next question in terms of transition. I want to know, I'm trying to keep it sort of simple. Our panel's called Just Transition Plenary. What does that mean? What does that mean to you and the work that you do, and how is it connected to your organization? So maybe if you can, and as a part of this question, if y'all can tell us a little bit about the work you do, but start with, what does Just Transition look like in terms of where we're headed? I think that's really a pointing point, Gopal, is that like, it can't just be about the fight. Like, we're fighting to win. And when we win, what kind of life do we want to have? And I think that's really important to even just to begin to envision that. When I teach, I'm a university professor. When I teach, the fact that, I ask that question, students are just blank. like, you know, because they're so stuck in the fight that all we see is the fight. So thank you so much for pointing that out. But for my next question, what does just transition mean to you? And you know, how does your organization or the work that you're doing sort of connect to that a little bit, so that way the folks who are listening and watching can learn a little bit about the work that you're doing in your organizations. And this way I'm just gonna go back around, not necessarily in the same order, but let's start with David this time.
Well, thank you. And it's such a rich conversation. I'm sort of enthralled by what's already been said, and my mind is racing with all of the depth and richness. So I'm going to do it two ways. I'm going to answer it abstractly, and then very concretely say what this means to live into it, to borrow a line from Gopal, right? So like, I've got clarity that the interconnection between white supremacy, capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and settler colonialism is the entire ideological framework and worldview in which I live. And I don't like it. And what I don't like about it is that it is a death cult, as Gopal has mentioned. It is power over, it is dominator, it is extractive, right? So I'm trying to transition away from that into a different worldview, one that is actually based on, in our language, we call it solidarity economy, a regenerative economy, however you want to describe that new economy, right? But one that is actually about sharing and nurturing and regenerating Mother Earth, and not just sort of using it faster than she can regenerate, but even more to get in relationship with living ecosystems, the way everybody once did. By the way, I want to lift up Chris Peters of the 7th Generation Fund for Indigenous Development, who taught me many years ago. He said, David, remember that you and every other human being descends from indigenous peoples. Every human being once lived in right relation within an ecosystem, and it's empire and conquest that has pushed people away from that. It's actually my birthright. I'll say it again. It's my birthright to live in right relation in a worldview of which I am a sacred part. This sort of power over thing was imposed on me, and I don't like it. But that means, so we have to be against capitalism for a solidarity economy. We have to be against heteropatriarchy and for a genuine gender inclusive notion of all people getting to be who they are. I can go down the list. I think it's really important for me. I code switch all the time. I'm not saying every conversation I start says, I got to make sure that you understand about white supremacy and capitalism, because some people, like, I can't start there because that's not where they are. But I encourage every listener of this panel to get clear in your own mind so that you can code switch. Because if you're afraid in your heart to acknowledge that the whole thing is power over domination, then you're always going to be confused, right? So I'm going to very quickly now take this opportunity to say what this actually looks like. And what it looks like for Michelle and I is Dishgamu Humboldt. I am with Cooperation Humboldt, a local community organization. Michelle has already been introduced as the tribal administrator of the Wiyot tribe. We are creating an indigenous-led community land trust to engage in an entire suite of regenerative economic development, right? And I want to be clear, that means worker co-ops, it means housing, it means like all of the things that we need to survive economic development. Affordable housing is there because as part of the heart, because that's a key component part. We've got multiple projects that we actually are in pre-development on and ready to go. The ecological restoration is there because, bluntly, the Wiyot people have stewarded this land since time immemorial. I am an uninvited guest on unceded Wiyot territory. But so my aspiration is to learn from them with humility how to be on this land because I don't have anywhere to go, right? Like the reality is I descend from Scottish and Irish, but it's lost to me. That was stolen from me. I don't know even where to go. So I have to be here. So I want to be here properly. So that's the big part of the heart. I want to just point out the Wiyot tribe is at the center with 4 diamonds because the what we're creating, the Wiyot Tribal Council has already agreed to take the power and responsibility to always designate 4 designees to the board of Dishgamu Humboldt. Cooperation Humboldt, with its 1 diamond, will have 1 designee. A community organization, we hope that our local foundation will have 1, and Full Spectrum Capital Partners will have 1. Notice the ratio, 4, 1, 1, 1. So the majority is always the Wiyot tribe. The other players get 1 each. And that's another thing I want to lift up. It is an organizational commitment and relationship. We don't have a memorandum of understanding. We have a memorandum of commitment to be in right relation with one another and to begin the process of healing ourselves and heal the land, because by healing the land, we heal ourselves. That's the transition I want to be part of.
Thank you so much, David, for that. So I'm going to go with maybe Michelle can sort of follow up since y'all are kind of working collaboratively together on this. What is just transition? I mean, if you want to add to, like, feel free to sort of jump in and add anything, or, something completely different.
Sure, and I apologize for, I'll turn on my video for just a second. I'm having internet issues today, so I think I'll end up being digital nonsense if I keep my video on. So, the way that I envision this is, and David hears me talk about a lot, is place-based healing. And by place-based healing, I mean, just like when you have a family, an individual family, or a person who goes through a traumatic experience, you go through individual therapy or group therapy or family therapy in order to move forward and heal from the trauma. A lot of the work that David and I are doing is around this place and the history of intergenerational trauma in this area. And it affects, both Wiyot people and everyone else in this community. And so that is, the nature of the work I think the tribe has been working on for a long time. And along the way, I began working with the tribe, and Cooperation Humboldt started working together on various issues. And like we were talking about earlier, some of those issues were reactionary. We were reacting happen in our community. Cooperation Humboldt helped, answered our call, so to speak, when we had someone, a big corporation that was coming to town and was looking to destroy a sacred site. They also helped when the city of Eureka was planning to, or the city of Eureka was planning to transfer a large chunk of an island that is considered the center of the Wiyot world. It's both culturally, religiously sacred, but also a place that there was a massacre that happened in this particular location. And over time, the tribe had purchased a piece of the land, and also the city of Eureka had given another piece of the land to the tribe. And we had done a lot of environmental restoration of that land over the course of 14 years. So after, this huge healing that happened in our community as a result of the tribe purchasing back and the city giving back an additional section of the land, and the tribe working to environmentally restore this piece of land for many, many years, we had a local billionaire that opposed the city transferring that second piece to the tribe, and Cooperation Humboldt came out in full force to help us during that time period. They also helped during the COVID crisis, and we've done a lot of food sovereignty work together, and just increasing access to food in our community. But we were working on this idea of working towards something that's better, instead of reacting to what's happening to us. Working on trying to envision the community that we want to see, and working towards that place-based healing in our community. And, growing up, I know, I was always taught that, you are what you do. So if you play the piano every day, you're a pianist or a musician. If you garden every day, people call you a gardener. And so, what we're the name of the name of Dishgamu Humboldt is actually a Wiyot word. Dishgamu means love. So we named this new community land trust Love because we're putting love into our community. And that is another concept that I grew up with is that you do in a good way, that you don't invest like eating something like all raging and full of hate, anger. It would translate itself into what you were taking, and then anybody who has that would then take. So I grew up, everything you do in a good way. And so this creation that we're working on is all about that. It's putting love and good energy into our community.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I'm gonna go over to Anna, if you can sort of, continue that conversation. What does the Just Transition look like to you? And, how does your organization sort of participate in that?
Absolutely. Michelle, thank you so much for phrasing it the way you did, because I think in organizing spaces, we talk very little about love, and that is what should be at the center of it all. And so when David, you kind of got us to look at it at a broad spectrum of transitioning away from capitalism, transitioning away from racism, what are we going to? We're going toward an economy based on love, a world based on love. And that means we need to, number one, honor and respect the way that Indigenous people have cared for the land over thousands of years, and realizing that we need to do our part to give back and to be in right relationship with the earth, with the land, with each other, and give that land back. I feel like we cannot forget the land back movement. And also, we need to break it down into smaller chunks, right? So yes, I am executive director of One Step a la Vez, and we are part of the Central Coast Climate Justice Network, where it is very clear that we are centering this work on those most impacted by the harm, which are BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous people of color. And so I think it's really important to insert this, because I do see a lot of white sisters and brothers on this Zoom right now. And so when you break it down into smaller chunks about the organization that you're involved in, if you find yourself surrounded by mostly or exclusively white people on your board, there's an issue with that, because you don't have the information from your Black, Indigenous, people of color siblings on what their daily experience is like in this world. And so, we cannot shy away from this conversation. And it's not in a tokenizing way. It doesn't mean that we're trying to get you to check boxes like, oh, I got that one Black person, I got that one Latino, it's actually about honoring the leadership that has already taken place on the ground by BIPOC people. It's not like they're absent from the conversation. You just may not be talking to them. And so what we have done here is we started a grassroots Green New Deal house meeting campaign in Santa Barbara County, because when elected officials call meetings for people to go to City Hall, to go to the Board of Supervisors meeting, you know what? Those meetings are usually in English. They're usually no childcare provided and do not feel welcoming. And those meetings happen during the day when people are working. So with house meeting campaigns, you're able to have the house meetings in a place where people are comfortable, where they can speak the language of their choosing, and they can voice honestly what their aspirations, what their visions are for their communities, and then framing a policy package around that, so that when we talk about just transition, yes, oil workers are important for oil workers to get a transition to meaningful work. And we as environmentalists need to be shouting that at the top of our lungs. It can't just be wind, solar, without saying, what kind of economy is this? Is this going to be another economy based on poverty? Are we going to have living wages? Are we going to have health care? People need to be taken care of. So when we're thinking about these new things, we need to remember that. Because if you were, born and raised in a middle to upper class environment, you don't necessarily realize how harmful it is when the discussion becomes just about, one thing, when it becomes just about the separation, right, of land from the people. It's like we are together, we are the environment. So it all needs to be included. And so we did this campaign in Santa Barbara County. We conducted close to 30 house meetings with about 400 participants. And these house meetings are from 5 to a dozen people. And from that, a 70-page paper that was done in partnership with the UCSB Environmental Studies Department was created. And now we're distilling that into, more policy package kind of fact sheets that we will be lobbying our Santa Barbara County Board of Supervisors. And we have started this also in Ventura County, because we don't want this to be one county does this and the other county is kind of left in the dust. So we're doing this as a regional effort. And we want to envision, right, this just transition that is beautiful and lush and based on love, and that doesn't leave anybody behind.
Cool. Thank you so much, Anna. And it sounds like great work you're doing there. Gopal.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate everything that's been lifted up so far. And I have the ridiculous advantage of having written down collectively with Movement Generation what we think a just transition is. So I just put the link in, and probably I shouldn't waste any time answering the question, but I'm going to anyway. But folks can check out, this was the first draft of a little booklet we put together called From Banks and Tanks to Cooperation and Caring, about how we envision a just transition. The expression greatly predates us and predates this moment. It was really, at least from the perspective of the quote unquote United States, are organizing on Turtle Island between environmental justice communities and labor organizations getting together and saying, wait, we do shitty work that's bad for the environment and the communities around us, and the environmental justice movement saying, really creating this massive shift in the environmental movement of reintegrating human communities into the concept of the environment, the notion of the environment as a way, which is a dangerous idea. And so that idea of like, how do we transition workers out of polluting, dirty industries into industries that serve communities and meet people's needs. And so the question for us is, okay, that's really important, but now we have to imagine how we transition not just workers from polluting industries, how do we transition whole communities and whole economies? And that's kind of at the heart of it. And I want to really appreciate the emphasis on love. We Movement Generation, we're a collective, and we are the Justice and Ecology Project, and we talk about ecological justice. So ecology, eco means home, right? So ecological justice is the idea of applied knowledge of home towards justice. And the definition of justice we use is, justice is what love looks like in public, from Cornell West. And then that begs the question, what does love look like? And for that, I invite us to look to Bell Hooks, who talks about love as a commitment, as active, as not just a feeling, but as actually agency in the world and responsibility taking. So for me, that's an important piece of it. I do want to speak to the sort of what it specifically it looks like, but I also want to just name also that I wanted to ask everybody a quick question, which is, how many people believe the rent is too damn high? I can only see like one screen at a time, but like, raise your hand or make a reaction if you think the rent is too damn high, right? Maybe some people are in parts of the world where you don't pay rent, thank goodness. But raise your hand now if you actually still pay your rent. Like, let's be honest, right? Like, we don't pay our rent primarily because we consent to the idea of rent. Like, it's not like we've bought into the hegemony of rent. And we don't primarily pay our rent because we're actually worried that that our primary fear is that the cops are going to come and kick us out of our home. That is an inevitable consequence, because any economy based on the enclosure of wealth and power requires violence as its primary mechanism of governance. But that's not the primary motivation why we pay our rent. We pay our rent because we have no other way to get our housing needs met. And until we as a social movement are addressing that question, people will always be required to comply. The primary issue for our movement is not that we consent to the legitimacy of the system. That's been eroding steadily over time. And the primary reason isn't because, for most communities, not all communities, but the primary reason isn't because the imminent threat of violence. That, of course, is true for communities who are resisting the imposition on their communities. Dakota Access Pipeline is a really good example of Standing Rock Sioux. We can go on and on. Line 3, we can go on and on. It's actually, most of us, it's not a matter of consent or coercion, it's a matter of compliance. It's that we don't actually we as a social movement have not focused on how do we actually meet people's needs. So that's the first thing I want to lift up. The second thing I want to lift up is how many people believe that healthcare is a human right? How many people believe housing is a human right? If you believe that healthcare is a human right, that means that all economic activity must be subordinate to that right. That the nature of the economy, that's the meaning of rights, right? Rights are not given, rights are not taken away. They're inherent, they're exercised, and they are only ever violated, and that is the origin of violence. And so if we believe that there are some fundamental rights, then we must insist that economic activity be organized around those rights. And I think that is what a just transition is about. It's about us living into the world we know we need. And that building of economy in our communities is the mechanism by which we confront the illegitimacy of existing structures of authority and existing power. And for me, what does that look like? For me, that's food sovereignty. That's communities having control over their food system. It's about food sovereignty and the peasant food web and indigenous and subsistence foodways and urban food growing as the alternative to the industrial mining for calories that dominates the food system. It's energy democracy. It's community ownership, control, and governance of clean energy in their communities, in our communities. It's economic democracy, it's worker ownership and community ownership. And so all of the work is about figuring that out for me. And it's like, and we have to remember, it's not about like anything new. It's actually about remembering our way forward, right? Enclosure is an infringement upon the commons. The commons came first. It's the enclosure that happens. Commons is not an alternative to enclosure. Enclosure is an infringement upon the commons, right? Abolition is not an alternative to policing in prisons or an alternative to slavery. Policing in prisons and slavery are an infringement upon freedom which pre-existed. So it's about, for me, it's about that. It's about remembering that. And the last thing I'll say for y'all, and then I really will shut up, which is, I know a lot of us and many folks here on this call, I'm presuming, entered into the transition towns movement primarily out of a concern for example, climate change or the environment. And it is not the case that this is about like, oh, we can address the environmental crisis and we can address social justice issues at the same time. It's not a win-win. It is the only way to win because social inequity is the thing that created the crisis in the first place. And it is insufficient to understand the climate crisis by looking up at the atmosphere and counting carbon. It is about the exploitation of land and labor and living systems on the ground, on the planet, everywhere at once, right? The climate crisis, the atmospheric crisis is just the emergent consequence of exploiting communities and living systems on the ground. So it's, the landscape of struggle is the economy. Build a different economy, build it well, because the only way for us to be ungovernable is to effectively self-govern. That would be my definition of a just transition and my suggestion for how we get there.
Thank you so much, Gopal. I'm hearing a lot of really amazing stuff, honestly. Like I caught myself right there changing from moderator to just like active listener because I'm learning a lot from all of you. And a couple of things that I think are really that I want to point out from some of the conversations y'all are having is is that there's always, a lot of anger, right? Like that builds up when you do social justice movement work. And I think one of the things that, kind of started this conversation for me was, like, what did we do? Like the praxis piece, right? And I think it's really really beautiful that you all are talking about this sort of right relationship, the concept of relationship, and that I remember growing up thinking that the economy was this complex sort of thing that like abstract. When people talk about the economy, they always talk about it really abstractly. But I always try to remember that the economy is just really how we organize the things that we need to the things that we need to survive. Like all the things that you're saying, that's all the economy is really, is how do we produce and procure the things that we need to survive: housing, water, food. And if we just do it differently, if we change the relationships, what Marx referred to as the social relationships of production, social relations of production, which sounds really complicated, but it's not. We just have to change how we provide housing. We have to change how we provide food. And y'all are giving a bunch of awesome examples of people who are not necessarily like innovating, like Gopal was saying, is that this is how it was done before the imposition of this other type of economy, this extractive economy called capitalism. But a lot of that starts with social relationships. It starts with living, the way that y'all are describing this is, it starts with living into the world. And this is one of the things that I try to sort of talk to with folks about, is that, like, and part of this has to do with a little bit with language. I see there was a discussion on the chat about language. And, I'm not going to sort of have that conversation, because that also gets into the imposition of like communities of color who develop their own pedagogical language, right? How people connect through and use language as a form of like, exasperation. So like, I actually don't have an issue with my daughter. She's 9 years old. Like, not cursing at people, but cursing just like her feelings, because it allows her to like let go of that, whatever that feeling is. But in terms of like the praxis piece is really important. The praxis is like, how do you live your ideology or your values into like being? And I think a lot of times we get stuck at like just the critique, and just like, we know that there's something wrong, we know that this is a thing that is wrong, but then I don't know how to change it. And so it's really beautiful to hear y'all talk about, relationships, because at the end of the day, that it really boils down to how do we treat each other, how do we, and then also, like, I think one of the things that happens in capitalism in this society particularly is that we also have very stunted and very narrow definitions of love. So it's even really weird to talk about love, right? So the fact that y'all are talking and actively using this concept of love, that is not one concept. Love has all kinds of different manifestations. And I think that's beautiful in and of itself, acknowledging that. And aside from like the concept of romantic love, I am an affectionate person. I grew up, my family giving me lots of affection. Also, some trauma from, having really young parents who didn't know how to parent, but they still showed me love, right? And then sort of experiences with this world where like love is only this romantic thing, and like people reacting to that, it gets really murky. Anyway, I'm talking too much. I'm just really fascinated by the conversation, and really interested in sort of everything that you're saying, because at the end of the day, it's really about the relationship with the people that you're interacting with. And I went to a school at UC Santa Barbara, and I learned a lot from the Chumash folks there, in the Santa Ynez and in the Santa Barbara area. And one of the very first things I learned was the term metakoyasi, which translates into to all my relations. And they say this all this time, and not just my active living relations, it's all the relations before me. So David, thank you very much for recognizing that we all come from, at some point, some indigenous community, thousands of years ago, who had right relationship with the ecosystem. And so as we sort of continue this conversation, I'm gonna sort of get into just, like, how are folks feeling about where we're at, and the work that y'all are doing. Y'all had told us a little bit about some of the work you're doing. How do you feel about, where this movement is at, transitioning, and also like where it's going and what needs to be done? How can people get it involved in the context of like helping people develop and transition from not just, the system. I was thinking when David was talking, I was thinking about Gramsci. And he talks about historical blocks, right? A historical block is like one way of doing things. And we are in this, and you had 4 things. I was only able to jot down 3 of them, but like heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, and like we have this way of like this hegemonic way of doing things, and we're trying to transition away to different ways of doing things and to try to develop a counter hegemonic strategy, which, you know, is a different historical block. And it's important, back to the sort of language, to not just be like, you know, like, in apologies for the language, but shit talkers, right? We can't just shit talk our way through this. We have to actually do things. Well, how can people do things? So where are we at in terms of the movement? How do you all feel about where we're at? What work needs to be done? Obviously, there's a ton of work that needs to be done, but also how can people get involved into some of that work? And then I'll start with let me go with Michelle this time. Sorry if
That's all right.
I can't see your picture, so like I don't like I feel weird calling on, but I understand the tech. I totally get it.
Yeah, I don't know why the internet decided today to be fuzzy, but it keeps kicking me out. I don't know if you noticed.
So it's just, the reason I apologize is because when I turn off my screen is because I'm gonna go get a glass of water really quick or something. So I'm like, I hope that you're there. Like it's like when I'm talking to students and I'm like having a seance. Hello, you know. But anyway, thank you. I'm glad that you're there, Michelle. Go ahead and you know, talk to us about that or anything. Honestly, really anything that you want to talk about.
Well, I just like to say that I'm middle-aged, and so I have this like I'm at this place where I have seen some fruits of my work over the years. I was just actually at a conference with David not too long ago, and the person that was speaking in the next session happened to be somebody I went to college with, and you know, she had tuned into my presentation, and then I tuned into hers, and she said in hers that it was good to hear some of the stuff that she'd done that we had done as college students had happened, because she was no longer in our area. And that I think stuck with me, that, you know, I have this, you know, with age, you get this perspective that you keep, you know, slowly trudging forward, one foot at a time, put some work into it every day, and things do eventually happen. And sometimes I think this world that we live in is so like messy, and you know, you look at the news and it just sounds horrible every day, but there are things that are good that are going on. And I think that part of change in our communities and changing the world we live in is also having respect for other people and acknowledging people, and also kind of understanding sometimes that ignorance comes from the place where, you know, the society that we grew up in. And so kind of having compassion for other human beings that, you know, they might not know better, and trying to help them to see a different perspective. You can't, you know, there's a lot of people out there that you're not gonna help along with new perspectives, and you just got to walk away from that and not get into nastiness. But that, I think that's, you know, a lot of the work that David and I are doing with Dishgamu locally is we're working towards the things in our community that are needed. Like, you know, we just had that little conversation about affordable housing, and you know, all across California, Indigenous people are being priced out of housing in the place where they've lived for, you know, tens of thousands of years. And you know, we're working on trying to take, you know, the decommodify land and take that that piece out so that everybody can afford to live. We're looking at, and that's something that, you know, everybody in this area is experiencing. And I'm sure, you know, wherever you are, you know, that's happening all across the United States. So, you know, trying to work on how are we all connected? What can we all do? David talked about code switching, and that's not a word I use all the time, but it's like connecting on a level that other people can relate to as human beings. You know, all of us are struggling to pay our rent. That is something we can all connect with. All of us want good paying jobs. They might not really understand the language, the movement language, but they understand being able to raise their kids and, you know, be able to afford childcare and being able to put food on the table at the same time. That's something we can all relate to as human beings. And so talking on those points.
Oh, Michelle, we got cut off. Let me see if she her signal gets back on track. Second. Michelle, this is the seance I was referring to. Michelle, no, I feel bad. I feel bad because she was actually like going on making excellent points. Give it another couple seconds, and then if not, we can come back
Thanks.
there. Okay, Michelle, there we got you back. So you got cut off maybe like a minute ago. Wait, did she sign off?
No, she's gone. Yeah.
Is that
Okay.
better?
Oh, back.
Yeah, that's better. We have her there. Michelle? And now she muted herself.
I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yes, there we go. All right, so you got cut off like about a minute ago.
So I'm not sure where I got weirdly digital, but if somebody could let me know.
It was just like maybe a minute ago. So if you just want to kind of sum up the last minute or so of your conversation, and then continue.
So basically trying to relate to people instead of being, hating on other people that don't believe similarly, just trying to connect on the level where we all can relate and move forward to changes in our community that can help us all. I think that's where I was going.
Thank you, Michelle. All right, let's go with Gopal.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Michelle. I think that for me is like this important principle around emphasizing what are the needs in our communities that are not being met or being met poorly or being met at the consequence of exploitation and extractivism. And then like, how do we meet those needs in a way that actually is really rooted in care, compassion, sacredness, and that centers relationships and relationship-based thinking and relationship-based approaches. That to me is at the heart of what the work has to be. And so for me, it's not like, for example, like I'm part of People's Solar Energy Fund, and we support community-owned clean energy projects that are democratic cooperatives. And for me, it's not actually about the solar panels. It's about the self-governance. It's about energy democracy. It's not just about, about decarbonization. It's actually about democratization, decentralization, distributed generation, diversification, and decolonization of the way we think about resources and resource allocations. And to me, the solar part is important, but a relatively small piece of the larger picture here. And that's the same thing with food sovereignty. It's about communities being able to find their own food system. It's like, what are we doing to support the peasant food web? And again, when you think about the peasant food web and indigenous food systems, La Via Campesina, the largest social movement, most likely the largest social movement on the planet, with millions of members of peasants all over the world and subsistence farmers and fisher folk and urban farmers, their slogan is "Small farmers cool the planet," because the notion of regenerative agroecological decentralized food systems that are based in community is actually the strategy to address the climate crisis. It's the CO2, as my friend Martha Dinarguello points out, is the co-pollutant. It's like, if you actually address the things that impact people's health, if you focus on what's happening in the community, then the other things get addressed. I wanted to actually build on a couple of things that were said earlier too, just really quickly. One is, Alfredo, when you were talking about like, we can provide housing, like we have to change the way we provide housing. Everybody can have housing, we have to change the way we provide housing. Everybody can have healthcare, we have to change the way we provide healthcare. I think that's absolutely true. And there's another piece that I didn't hear that is really important. We have to change the way we conceive of healthcare. We have to change the way we conceive of housing in order to ensure that everybody has it. Because if I say, who believes in universal healthcare, everybody raises their hand. If I start to ask you, when you imagine what universal healthcare looks like, what do you imagine? Most people, when I do that, most of my students, most organizers imagine that it's free, that you can go into the hospital and you don't have to pay for medicines and you can go get whatever treatments that you need. But actually the industrialized healthcare system is the net transfer of life expectancy from poor people in the global south to rich people in the global north. That is not a universal model. It is predicated on the assumption that we can extract wealth from someplace, deplete it, destroy it, and create health conditions that, that are deeply problematic, right? So we have to actually reimagine what health and well-being means outside of the colonial Western mind. So I wanted to just lift that up because it's not enough for us to think that that it's simply a problem of distribution. It's actually a problem of conception. It's a problem of centering individuals, centering objects, as opposed to centering relationships. And that's the thing that everybody here is talking about. It's like, what does it mean to be in right relationship? What does it mean to have a reciprocal, responsible, reflective, and regenerative relationship to each other and to the rest of the living world? Because all wealth is generated through the work of the living world. Whether it's the microbial life in the soil or the black bodies who created the foundation of the wealth that America is built on through enslavement and the settler colonial project that took people's land. All wealth is generated through the work of the living world. And I also want to say we have to reconceive our notion of work. We have to stop, like all living things take energy from the sun, they convert it into power to do work. And we have to stop distinguishing between the beating of a heart and the singing of a song and the telling of a story and the hugging of a child and the building of a building and the planting of a seed. It's all work. And the notion of productive work and reproductive work and unproductive work is a structure of thinking that makes us not value everybody, every person, every way of being. That is not who we come from. None of us come from that way of being. That is brand spanking new. Like, if you want to get technical, you can say 10,000 years. But even that's brand spanking new, right? So 3,000, yeah, is more accurate, right? So it's like, you know, I just want to lift that up. And the last thing I want to say, because I'm watching this thread on language, and I just want to lift up, like, language isn't just about the words we use. And I think actually it's mostly not about the words we use. We are narrative animals. Narrative, the na in narrative is the na in no. Narrative is ways of making meaning. It's how we know. And we make meaning through metaphors. And for all of the time that we have been on the planet up until very recently, life was the metaphor for everything. And now machines are the metaphor for life. We talk about our bodies as engines, our minds as wired, our food as fuel, our DNA as code that can be edited and deleted and cut and pasted. And that matters. Like, our phones are running out of batteries and we say they're dying and we don't have energy to do something and we say we don't have bandwidth. The metaphors we use change how we make meaning of each other and the world around us. So if you're going to intervene on language, interrogate the metaphors that you're using. Do they reproduce white supremacy? Do they reproduce machine metaphors? Do they reproduce patriarchy? Because to be in right relationship, we have to restore the living system metaphors that help us make meaning of the world, just like all of our folks have always done. I think I went off the rails. I'm sorry.
No, this is all helpful, and I'm grateful that you sort of because I didn't want to not sort of address the conversation that's having in the chat, but also, like, I'm trying to sort of make sure that we have our conversation, and so that, you know, all of it sort of it's just good to be in conversation and to be able to get different perspectives, especially how we define what's, you know, good language and who gets to define it, right? That's one of my issues is where is the policing of it coming from, and so I think it's important to really, like, analyze, okay, like, you know, what's the rub here. So thank you very much for addressing that, Gopal. David.
Well, I'm so glad that I get to go after this because I'm also going to hearken back, Alfredo, to something that you mentioned, because I think a lot about anger. Because I'll confess, I get very angry when I think about how horrific exploitation and oppression is, and how, and one of the things that I really realized for myself is a couple of things. I have a spiritual and political practice. One part of my spiritual practice is to just acknowledge that the goddess, how I understand the cosmic divine, does not demand or expect of me perfection, nor does she expect or demand of me that I succeed or win. She demands and expects of me to do my best. And so I really am trying to do my best always. I sometimes fail, right? Like I'm not always my best self. And we're all better than the mistakes that we make. And I also try to say, I'm never interested really in assigning blame either to myself or anybody else. I'm interested in identifying gaps and trying to close them, right? Like, and so as when I know better, I do better, right? Yeah, we know that, great poet. But the other thing about anger is, like, actually, we should be provoked. Anger should be provocative, right? We should be anger at this level of injustice. But if we just stay stuck in anger, that is toxic. It will destroy us and everybody around us. It is profoundly unhelpful, right? It is unhealthy even to ourselves. And that's where I have experienced that when something provokes me to anger, if I actually try to intervene and change the narrative or change what's happening or make the circumstance how to the best of my ability, not that I can always succeed, but if I intervene and do my best to try to provide some either salve to those suffering or create new systems, it becomes joyful, right? There's like some kind of cosmic alchemy associated with allowing yourself to feel angry about something and then engage with labor. And thank you again, Gopal. I don't want to fanboy too much, but yes, because this is the thing, as a good Marxist, what I know is that, yes, the surplus value of labor, but here's the thing, what's really interesting, that if you look at the root of those words, work was actually a slur. It was sort of an insult because you were not able to simply take care of yourself or your family based on your own labor. Labor was meaningful, productive human activity. And there were different types of labor, but that's labor. Labor is absolutely sacred, right? Work is the problem because we've commodified our time in order to have to sell our time in order to get money to organize society and get the things that we need. Again, Alfredo, you're sort of reminding us the importance of understanding economy is just how we allocate how goods and services that we need to live are produced and distributed and so forth. That's why capitalism is so incredibly profane and so incredibly dangerous, because it literally, look, I'm gonna break it down. Professor, tell me if I get it right. I can describe capitalism to elementary school kids. There are 5 characteristics to capitalism. 1, the private ownership of the means of production. Number 2, that things are produced as commodities to be bought and paid for at a profit instead of use value, like you produce things because they're needed to be used, right? So commodities, right? Number 3, that labor itself is just one more commodity that's bought and paid for. Number 4, that everything is about profit maximization. You buy and sell these things for profit. You don't do it out of joy. You don't do it out of creativity. You don't do it out of love. You do it out of profit maximization. And the 5th, the whole thing is allocated through the market. Those are the 5 characteristics. Look it up, y'all. I ain't joking. Like, go to Wikipedia or any other, go to an intro to macroeconomics. And taken simply alone, those 5 things, they seem, oh, okay, that actually makes sense. The problem is when you think about the implications altogether, it's the ideology of cancer. It is literally premised upon an unlimited commodification and growth on a finite planet. If we don't get into right relationship and back into the balance where we are appropriately on this human earth, then we're going to all die. And there's going to be a lot of suffering along the way. That's why stories, because we all make sense of the world through stories. And I try as much as possible, I believe in the projects that I do because the projects are the things that we do. But everything I do, I try to actually engage as storytelling. And the story that I'm telling is that I want to move away from power over to power with, away from domination to collaboration. And I'm going to say away from hate and death and to love and life. And I can't wait to hear what Ana Rosa has to say.
Yeah, I mean, I love all the talk about systems. And for me, I just feel like we can't forget the people that we're talking about within the systems. And so for me, the personal is political. And, you know, I wasn't going to engage in the conversation about language, but Jess knows this because she's my best friend, but I don't curse that much. But when it comes to talking about capitalism, it pisses me the fuck off because I look at my mom and her health and how she has to be on oxygen and take more pills than I can honestly count on a daily basis. That is fucking capitalism. And so I'm done with the tone policing. And I think this happens to people a lot where it's like, we need to practice hearing each other. If we're so stuck on the words and we can't hear the sentiment behind it and why people are expressing themselves the way they are, we're not in right relationship with each other. So when I say that with a lot of love. It's not out of any disrespect to anyone, but here in Fillmore, this area has been completely neglected. This whole Santa Clara River Valley, you know, Fillmore, Piru, Bardsdale, Santa Paula. And when the youth come in here to our center, they have so much trauma. Like, I can't tell you the stories, like it breaks my heart, honestly. And we want to provide the youth here with an opportunity to have a good living. So we actually have a partnership with Pass It Forward and the Laborers Union, where we have trained a first cohort in how to build with hempcrete. And so that first cohort was very successful. So now we're going to do a second cohort starting November 1st, and then a following cohort in the spring. And, you know, these good jobs, these are just a starting point. We also are trying to educate where the K through 12 system is failing our youth, because if you look at Fillmore High School, there is no ethnic studies provided there. So what do? We have professors come and give Chicano studies talks at our center, because the K through 12 system teaches people to go pretty much be robots and be conforming to the existing world that we have. And so just transition, it kind of doesn't fully encapsulate what we need to do. What we need is a transformation. We need to use that kind of language, because it's not about tinkering this or changing this or that. It's like, we need to change everything. We have been failing our communities over so many years, and we need to just realize that we got to wake up. Nos tenemos que poner las pilas, as they say in Spanish. We got to, you know, really change it all. And we can't be scared of that. We got to get past that fear, because everything we want is on the other side of that fear.
Thank you very much, Anna. You know, like Gopal's comment about metaphors just hit right now, when like I've heard this the what you ended on, the poner las pilas, and it translates into we got to put our batteries on, and I've heard that all my life. And that was the first time it sort of like dawned on me that like, hey, that's the machine sort of metaphor, and and it goes back to like ways of thinking, right? What you all are saying is we have to transform the way in which we envision the world, like, you know, in a way, and that's like a hegemon. I mean, and I'll be honest, and this is also another reason like the language conversation is really for me murky. It's because you know, a couple semesters ago, a student complained about me because I actually curse a lot, because where I grew up, that's how we talked. That's sort of part of my pedagogy. That's how I relate with young people. Young people use a lot of new language, a lot of really creative language, and so sometimes I learn it and I'll use it. And I was really frustrated because I was really thinking about this. I was like, okay, do I start policing, changing my language a little bit? And then I was like, no, you know what? I'm really frustrated. The student was more offended by the language that I'm using than by the things that I'm talking about. I'm talking about racism, white supremacy, extreme levels of poverty, gentrification, dislocation. And this person cared less about that and more about the language I was using. And so I think it's important to, communities are going to use whatever languages like and I also come from communities where all my cousins, who are not, they're workers, they're in the system. They talk like, man, profusely. They're going left and right with like curse words, and I'm not going to be the one to say, hey, you shouldn't do that. But for me, it's actually more about relationships and like, how are we treating people? And so thank you all for all of these amazing conversations. And how do we translate like these ideas? How do we envision a new world? That's one of the first problems, right? Like, how do we even think outside of the capitalist sort of hegemonic construct, and then actually make that real? So I'll go with Gopal, and I'm going to sort of do a couple of last minute wrap up things, and then we'll start taking some questions in a few.
I wanted to acknowledge. I just wanted to comment very quickly on something Anara said that I think is really important, if that's okay, which
sure.
is I actually have this really deep frustration with just transition as an expression. And what's funny or what's ironic about that is I think people would associate movement generation with having really pushed this out into the world. And if you read our work on it or have attended any of our workshops and trainings, it's actually a theory of revolution, and that this idea that revolution is not, and a theory of transformation, and the idea that it's actually like revolution is not about the struggle for power. It's about the ability of people to exercise rights and contest the legitimacy of existing authority through the exercising of rights. And the rights that we think we should be exercising are rights of Mother Earth and new economic rights. And like essentially the idea that we should all have access to the resources required to create productive, dignified, and ecologically sustainable livelihoods. And that if we believe that that is a right, then those resources must be governed as essentially as commons, sustained over generations and governed through consent, not entitlement and enclosure. And but what's interesting is the word just transition ends up sounding like we're somehow gonna just like casually move our way into some better way of being. No, it's going to involve a serious contestation over the question of what relationships of power do we want. And this is what, like, getting back to the whole relationship thing, it's like power is a dimension of every single relationship. And if we do not govern and structure and culture for the relationships of power we want, we will end up with the relationships of power in the dominant society. And if we don't want patriarchy, and we don't want white supremacy, and we don't want meritocracy, and we don't want radical individualism, then we need to culture, structure, and govern with relationships of power we do want. And that's where equity and justice and love become the nature of power that we want. And that's not going to be easy. So I just wanted to really thank you for confronting the failure of just transition as a language, because we kind of got stuck with it by accident. Like, the movement, the just transition, the larger framework of the movement is really important. Don't get me wrong, but the way in which it gets interpreted as this kind of easy thing, I think is really dangerous, and it does sound transactional, and I find that, and that's a painful thing for me as somebody, I happen to be the primate at the keyboard when we put that booklet together, and it always bugs me that's what we ended up with. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And then the last thing here is, like, the whole conversation about language and swearing is really a conversation about who thinks that their culture or their worldview is somehow the backdrop to the world that we're like, is the default way that we should think. And I think like you got to let that go. Like maybe it offends you. That's okay. That's a cultural thing. There's lots of cultures for which the way we use, like, you know, but we live in a world in which we're navigating lots of different cultures. And so it's not actually about whether swearing is okay or not okay or hurts your feelings. It's like actually about who feels entitled to say that one kind of way of speaking is okay and another kind of way of speaking is not. That's really the central question. Who feels entitled? And entitlement is the basis of enclosure, and consent is the basis of commons. And so we have to really interrogate when we feel entitled to assert some kind of universal cultural assumption upon people.
Thank you very much, Gopal. And basically, you know, one of the things that I'm really hearing, and it's not a word I've heard us sort of say that much, but it's for me what wraps it all up is solidarity, right? Solidarity is not about, you know, like people doing things the way that I want them. Solidarity is like, you know, like I want to empower you to like solidarity is like I want to connect with you on human relationship levels, and to understand that you're a different human being and you're a different, you know, community with different needs and different contexts than mine, but I still support, like, you know, what empowers you. And for us to sort of develop these relationships, and I think it's really important. A lot of things that y'all are sort of really pointing to is how do we, and this is why it's also referred to as a solidarity economy. There's all kinds of language, and in sort of reference to language in general. One of the problems of capitalism is that you know, we're always stuck with the language that is given to us within this current context and system, right? And so part of the envisioning process is developing new language, but also the language also is, because it's cultural, it develops on its own. You know, like the rate at which I learn new trends and new words and new fads is like, you know, the newer generations are coming up with like all kinds of slang terms that like I can't even keep up with. And so I think that's actually a beautiful thing, because I think it means that there's a creativity there that people are trying to use to sort of give meaning to their own life. And so I'm going to open it up to questions now, so that we can have a conversation and folks can jump in and answer whichever questions sort of we get to. And then we'll sort of do a little bit of closing at the end. And when there's like, you know, maybe 15 minutes left, I'll sort of ask y'all for any closing remarks that y'all want to sort of engage in. But thank you very much for this really rich conversation, and we're going to continue it. I'm going to try and sort of mix it around. Mark Roast, and I apologize if I get your name wrong or I say it wrong. Mark Roast, I'll let you go first.
All right, thank you, Alfredo. And it's Roost like Sjoerd canoe because it's Dutch.
Roost.
And my grandfather was Scotch. And Sari Stoiber says, my frustration with how we create the new economy is how do we actually do that? How do we pay for, support people who are doing the work that supports a just world but isn't valued monetarily? Well, what I've been writing in the side and on my profile and all that is that I'm looking at trillions of dollars in sales of batteries and solar thin film and transportation that is electrified over the next 9 years, because the goal is to get rid of fossil fuels by 2030, and at margins, at gross margins that are unheard of, at least where most people are. So the idea is that we'll be able to finance the transition technologically to the things that we make, and we'll also be able to finance people purchasing the, let's say we're in a village in the developing world, we'll be able to purchase the equipment that enables that village to process their food or create some craft, something. It used to be that cities and towns each had their own specialties based on what their economy was based on locally, and it was the living economy, the surplus of the ecology. So like 10,000 languages, 10,000 ecosystems, 867 regional regions, ecoregions. We can organize around that. I've got plans for information technology as well as the energy and construction technologies that I learned from other people, and some of which I'm inventing. So we're going to be able to, by allying, like I want to bring the opportunity to create a cooperative to to convert vehicles. Instead of waiting for the vehicles to be old and wasted, we convert the good vehicles right now to full battery electric and put solar over the roof and stationary batteries to catch it and hold it for when you need to charge with it. And guess what? You guys are free of the utility, and you're free of buying any cars anymore or maintaining your cars, because all of a sudden the car doesn't need maintenance other than tires and wipers, and the energy is free from the sun. And that means that 25% of the average person's income has been freed up. It's 25% of GDP. When we no longer, once we've paid off the financing for converting to a sustainable economy, we are home free. We can actually start returning.
That sounds awesome, Mark. Did you have a question for our panelists about this?
No, I'm feeding that back to the panelists. I'm an elder. I'm doing my thing.
Do any of the panelists want to comment on Mark's
and hooray to what you guys are saying. You guys are fabulous, by the way.
I'll just respond with the quick thing of like, that I think is part of the calculus of People's Solar Energy Fund, which is a cooperative of communities who are developing community-owned, controlled, democratically governed clean energy projects. And that's just one formation, and we're trying to aggregate together, like the way it gets to larger issues of scale. Like we think of scale as just being bigger and bigger and bigger, and we have to reimagine scale in a different way. We have to think about the idea of aggregating to scale, like communities coming together and finding ways to share knowledge, resources, skills, and to create those kind of common resources. And that allows us to both decentralize and get to scale at the same time. In fact, getting to scale through decentralization is a potentially more rapid and more effective process. So I agree with that. I just also want to, and I think related to a comment in the chat, like absolutely, like energy efficiency and dampering down our consumption are two like absolutely essential components of the transition. It's not going to be like we're going to replace all our dirty energy with clean energy and everybody's going to be happy. But the key thing here is anytime you're talking about anything, whether it's the energy transition or the transportation transition, if you do not center questions of justice in the context of the society we're in, so for us, addressing issues of racial, economic, and gender inequality, disability justice, if that is not central to the way you think about the solutions, your solutions will not get us to where we need to be. Because if it is not changing the relationships of power in the larger economy, I really don't, I'm going to do it just for the sake of doing it, give a shit how much carbon reduction you focus on, because you're just moving the problem around. It's extracting wealth from a community in some other way, in some other form, or it's extracting wealth from the living world in some other way, in some other form. So that is my invitation. The first question anybody should be asking about any of the things you work on is, how is this centering social inequity as the actual problem we're trying to address? And as we do that, we actually do that within the constraints of the living systems upon which we interdepend. Like, that's the question. And if you don't start with that question, then you're not, there's no transition here. It's not a transition. It's just a moving things around in the existing structures of economy.
Thank you, Gopal. I'm going to go with Sergio has a question about cross-border work.
Thank you, Alfredo. Greetings from Mexico. I'm talking to you from Yucatan in southern Mexico. My question has to do with cooperation, cross-border cooperation between Mexico and the United States on energy issues. Well, here I'm working with different indigenous organizations where there's been a large number of land grabs already related to utility scale, very large scale renewable energy projects from corporations of different kinds. For example, here in Yucatan, there was a big case with SunPower, a California-based, Silicon Valley kind of green capitalism sort of company that was fortunately stopped. They were going to chop down 800 hectares of rainforest to put solar panels, still in the land of Mayan communities. But this is a pattern, this repeats in many different places. And at the same time, there's the other big thing that is happening here in Mexico, which is the influx of the fracking, US fracking gas, the construction of more gas pipelines, the construction of new power plants, creating this dependency in terms of energy with the United States, with the fracking industry particularly. Many of us see this as a key part of the understanding, like the basic deal between Mexico and the United States has a lot to do with this providing a new market for US fracking gas. There are alternatives to this. There are a larger number of indigenous organizations organizing in Mexico against this, both against large-scale mega projects that grab their lands, as well, many of which are also renewable energy, as well as against the gas pipelines and the power plants. But it all has a lot to do with the United States, because a lot of the capital is American, a lot of the companies are American. But what I have found is that there is very limited contact and cooperation. And I'm wondering if it would be, I think it would be very useful from the perspective of what is happening here to have more contact, more communication, more cooperation across the border. But I just don't really know where to start looking. And that's why I signed up for this forum. So yeah, that's the question. Thank you. Oh, and just by the way as well, there's more and more work being done here by indigenous communities proposing their own renewable energy projects that are related to ways of living that are based on commons. It's basically a way of using renewable energy to strengthen commons, strengthen lifestyles that actually work, but are having under a lot of attack and a lot of erosion. Basically things like strengthening sustainable agriculture, water access, these kind of things. And through that, productive systems that rely on a collaborative relation, basically on being part of the ecosystem. And this is also quite interesting. And I think there's a lot of that also happening in the United States. And that could also be a very interesting area for cooperation. Thank you.
Do any of our panelists want to handle the question of cross-border collaborations? I mean, there was a lot more there, right? Like not just that.
So
David?
I'll just jump in as I had the honor of serving as the co-coordinator of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, and we are the continental formation. I mean, there's so much going on, right? So, but one place to start, Sergio, is so there's the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, which is the North American Continental Association to RIPUS, which translates into the worldwide or global Social Solidarity Economy Network. I'm going to drop into the chat for you the Espanol version of the international website and see if you can find a connection in Mexico into that. So that might be helpful. I don't know.
Thank you, David. Anybody else have some comments on Sergio's question? How we can connect to? Is there already organizations who are doing some of this cross-border work? If not, is there some that might be interested in doing some of this cross-border collaboration?
I want to uplift that a lot of the environmental justice movement organizing does a lot of cross-border collaboration, particularly, and the climate justice movement as a whole has very internationalist orientation and solidarity work. You had mentioned the corporations and all of those things, but I also wanted to uplift that there are policy interventions that are deeply problematic. The state of California has an offset scheme with arrangement with Chiapas, the state of Chiapas in Mexico, Acre in Brazil, and other places in which we get to do we get to supposedly fund quote unquote clean energy projects in those communities, the kinds of things you were talking about, the devastation of biodiverse intact forests and displacement of indigenous peoples, so we can grow fast growing pine plantations, call them clean, and keep polluting on poor communities and communities of color in the state. And so people who are, you know, it's like, those are the kind of things that we need to intervene in and recognize those relationships. But the real cross-border collaboration, I think, is happening in the border justice networks, the Farm Worker and U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance is doing lots of cross-border collaboration and alliance building, and the environmental justice movement, particularly organizations in San Diego and other places, I think have been doing a lot of that.
Thank you, Gopal. I have a question from Deborah George in St. Paul, Minnesota. How can we incent people to move regenerative communities more quickly? It seems like people are waiting until crisis hits so hard that it can no longer be ignored. And how do we speed this up, basically? Which is a difficult question to ask, I know. Do any of our panelists who haven't spoken yet want to sort of chime in on this a little bit? Anna, Michelle, David. Not that I want to leave Gopal out, because I think Gopal's a rock star. I agree. I met him earlier today, and like David, I have a sustainability crush on him.
Well, just a question: is there any kind of, doesn't have to be called the same thing, but something equivalent to like what Transition US is in Mexico? Because with us doing Zoom, you know, it could be very easy to have meetings and do that cross-border solidarity. I mean, I know a lot of labor unions that do cross-border solidarity work, and that is a good entry point. But yeah, just wondering about that. If you could share with us, Sergio, or anybody else who might be here from Mexico that knows.
Doesn't seem like anybody in the.
There's some answers in the chat. There is a Transition Mexico hub and a link to that, so that may be useful.
And I'll just jump in. Thank you very much, Ana Rosa, for that. And again, the RIPUS will have connections in Mexico doing specifically solidarity economy, or social solidarity economy is how it's usually talked about globally. I also wanted to thank you, Alfredo, for lifting up the question from Deborah, because I think it's really important that we not wait until we feel like we've got all of the answers and all of the ways to actually do it, right? Like, and so where do we start? Where we live, work, play, and pray. And who do we do it with? With the people with whom we live, work, play, and pray. And Gopal, I saw your visual. I quote it all the time. The hands learn. Well, you say it because you'll say it better.
What the hands do, the heart learns.
Thank you, because I sometimes trip on it, but the point is, we just do it. We do our best and we lean in. And I do believe that I don't have the capacity to guarantee that all of Humboldt transforms, but I do have the capacity to transform how I'm in relation with the people around me and create Cooperation Humboldt as an institution to relate to the Wiyot tribe as the sovereign government here. And I do really want to be clear, like Michelle's heard me say this, like I, as much as possible, try to act and help other people to think and act as if the Wiyot tribe is actually the proper government here, because they know how to be here and have since time immemorial. And once again, I'll just quote from Movement Generation Zine: if we're not prepared to govern, we're not prepared to win. And I want to win. I want to win and live in an entirely new world.
Thank you, David. Anybody else want to chime in on that? If not, I'll move to the next question. I have Marissa.
So I'm really sorry.
No, go ahead, Gopal, and then Marissa's next.
I think I might have a disagreement with the premise of the question. I'm not, and it's not to say that I think it's not a correct question, but I think it's a perspective, a matter of perspective. Like, actually, what if it is happening all around us and we just don't realize it? What if we are in it, and because you, for whatever reason of your location or your community or your identity, you're not seeing it? There hasn't been a mass waste incinerator built in the United States in over 15 years because of grassroots organizing, one of the most polluting industries that there is. We are shutting down coal-fired power plants. Indigenous Environmental Network just put out a report about the 25% of US consumption of fossil fuels that they, annual percentage of fossil fuels that they've managed to keep out of the atmosphere simply through organizing against fossil fuel infrastructure in Indian country. I see disaster collectivism all around me. I see just recovery all around me. I see mutual aid organization all around me. I see Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities and poor white communities in Appalachia and in the Deep South getting organized in ways that I have not seen in the decades that I've been doing organizing. Something is different in this moment, and we can't see all of it at once because that is the nature of decentralization. And one of the powerful things about self-organization is emergence, is that at the next scale out, there will be emergent phenomenon that we cannot reduce to the activity of any given thing, but that will be fundamentally transformative. It's not linear. We're waiting for, we are preparing ourselves for the moments of ripeness. We are preparing ourselves for the moments of ripeness. What we saw in response in the Gulf South from this last hurricane, from grassroots organizing and the ability to really respond and meet people's needs and support communities and be organized for the transition, to take advantage of the, not advantage is not a good word, to recognize the opportunity in the moment for communities to advance a just agenda, I think is built on decades of organizing that is coming alive. So I just am not sure it's true that we need to wake, that people aren't awakened to it. I think we might not see it. What if we're winning and we just don't realize it?
That's an awesome way to think about it. And I think I can relate to the question in the sense of, just for me, there's always an urgency, right? I want more people involved in this. I want, like just much like that tidal wave, but you're right. A lot of this started, it started a long time ago, but like I mentioned earlier, David said about WTO, that was a very key, moment in some of this history where a lot of these conversations began, and 20 years later, now we're starting to see a lot of the fruits of that. So thank you for helping us reshape that. I'm gonna go with a question from Marissa, and I'm not gonna try to say your last name because I don't want to get it wrong.
Thank you. I'm so appreciating this conversation. Marissa Momarts, I'm on Transition US staff. I had the pleasure of hosting Gopal's colleague, Matteo Nube, many years ago for a webinar on just transition, and he spoke to the importance of the land reform movement and how that's had been, at the time at least, lacking in the US. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit to the role of land reform, particularly community land trusts. I'm sure we'll hear about some of the other solidarity economy models in our talk next week on regenerative systems with Emily Kawano. But what's the role of land reform in addressing the climate crisis, and how can folks who are here today leverage the resources they have access to accelerate that land reform?
Thank you for that really awesome question. And I actually was going to ask the same, see if Michelle wanted to sort of chime in on that a little bit, so we can hear from her, especially since they're doing some really innovative stuff in Humboldt. And then maybe Gopal can add any pieces he would like to. Michelle. Hello, Michelle. You want to chime in, Gopal, until Michelle comes back?
I'm sure.
I think I'm back.
Oh,
Yeah,
yay.
there she is.
I'm sorry. The internet is crazy today at my house, and of course, it only seems to act up as soon as I try to talk.
No worries, Michelle. We totally understand. As someone who teaches and has these problems all the time, and we're kind of used to it. So I just wanted to give you a space to also chime in on some of these questions.
I just wanted to hit on the point that the way we see land today is not is a colonial version of commodifying land is something that is not indigenous, that we did not own the land any more than we own the sky or we own the water. And I just wanted to put that out there, that a lot of the things that we are doing today with Corporation Humboldt and our community land trust is to take that out of the picture. So the way we make housing more affordable in our area is to take ownership of land out of the picture. So if you remove the piece where you own the land, the building on top of it becomes more affordable to the people that that live here in our area. Also, the way that we are working towards climate change in our community is, instead of this building out, which is a philosophy that is, it's like, the model for the way that America's been operating for many, many years, is that we just keep moving out of the inner city into the suburbs and just growing and growing and growing and growing. We're trying to actually move to, building into existing footprints and not tearing down forests and tearing down green spaces in order to build new construction projects, but to develop housing where there's an existing footprint. And we're using what we're calling deep green technology. We're not just talking about solar systems and reducing our carbon footprint by how we use electricity, or the technologies that of how we get electricity, but actually making more green in our environment. So that is how climate change happens, a little at a time. When you look at low-income housing developments, what I see is, it's not real. It's not a way that anybody would want to live. Who wants to live in a big cement square block with nothing green in it, right? That is part of the problem that we're having as a society, is creating these living spaces that to me aren't living, So we're looking at putting green back into our spaces by having community green spaces in our housing projects, and also to actually put green, growing living things into the places that we build. So, if we're putting together a apartment complex, we're putting rooftop gardens in, we're putting hallways that have green living spaces to grow things, and community spaces that are green. We're not going to be, we like to coin, we've been using the phrase, we're taking, parking lots and making them paradise, instead of taking, erasing a paradise and putting in a parking lot. We're doing the opposite. But that's how that is all connected with climate change, and just a totally different way of doing business, taking the money out of the land and putting green into everything we do.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Do you want to add anything to that, Gopal, briefly?
That's absolutely right. We have to decommodify land. Like, we can't subordinate land to privatization. That's enclosure, right? Enclosure is an infringement upon that which was once a common pool resource, a resource upon which all in a community depend. And so the community self-governed in a way that sustained it over time, and for the meaning across generations. Like, that's what that means. So I think that's, it is community land trusts. It is, which are, incremental mechanisms for decolonization of land. It is land back, of course. It's also the question of what land-based reparations looks like, and looking at the alliances and the relationships being built between Black and Indigenous communities around land and housing. I think that, to me, is really important. And I'm fond of saying that we have to liberate the soil from the physical concrete that paves over life, and we have to liberate our imaginations from the cognitive concrete that paves over our spirits and our souls. And actually, it turns out that the fastest way to and those two things are in a dynamic relationship. Like if you take a sledgehammer to the physical concrete to liberate the soil, you will liberate your imagination. You will crack the cognitive concrete and liberate your spirit. And in order to take a sledgehammer to the physical concrete, you first have to, like, you know, you have to take that step. So those two things are in this dynamic relationship. So just, you know, the homework after we're all done here is everybody go outside, grab a sledgehammer and take out a big chunk of concrete. And if you don't feel like you can do that, just go get some amaranth and plant it in the cracks, because the amaranth will do the work for you and start tearing up the concrete.
Thank you, Gopal. We're nearing the end, so I have time. We're gonna go over a little bit, so I want to make sure I get a couple more questions. So I'm gonna go with Galen and then Rua and Lewis. But before I do that, we're gonna post a link in the chat to a little survey that we would appreciate if you all can do about the panel. Jess just dropped it into the chat. So if folks can please go ahead and just, you know, submit that survey, just so we can get some feedback about what you thought about the panel, the summit, and just, you know, how we can improve some of these conversations moving forward. I really appreciate it. Jess, do you want to say anything else about that?
Nope, that was perfect. We just really appreciate your feedback, and y'all are doing amazing. I'm having a great time listening. Thank y'all.
Cool. All right. So I'm going to go with, again, apologies if we're going a little bit over, but this conversation is awesome. And I want to make sure that some of our participants get a chance to ask their questions. Galen, I'm going to go with you, and then Rua and Lewis.
All right. Thank you. And thank you to all the panelists. First, I just want to express my tremendous gratitude for you all. It's so inspiring and enlivening to hear you speak. And I just want to share what comes up for me in these conversations, in these kinds of conversations, almost always, is that I get a felt sense of this. There's like this sense of a dichotomy between, you know, such the beauty and the importance and the majesty of recognizing oneness with all life, oneness with all humanity, and the tremendous importance and even urgency of recognizing differences and appreciating needing to grow the capacity to hold space, to hear what others' experiences have been, to hold space for the trauma, to hold space for our different unique expressions of the trauma, and to be cultivating conversations that can actually lead into regenerative relationships and into regenerative action, restorative justice. And I just want to ask, you know, what thoughts are out there as to how we can facilitate being able to hold these false dichotomies more integratively?
I'm gonna see if I'm gonna give you Anna, if you want to see if you want to jump in and jump on that question. If not, I just want to make sure I'm spreading it around, but also don't want to put anybody on the spot.
No worries. Thank you so much for that question. I think so much of it begins with healing ourselves, because we can't really engage in any of this work without doing that internal work. And just recently, I would say the last year or two, I have realized how many lies, like, I've been fed my whole life, and how those lies have funneled my behavior to go in certain directions. And so just like that process of decolonization, yes, it's a real thing that manifests itself like externally, but also internally. So I think that that's the first part. And then from there, we can work with others.
Anybody else want to add to that?
I just would like to say that sometimes it's easy to get disheartened in this world we live in, especially if you watch the news or you get on the internet. It seems like it's just this, you know, this horrible scenes happening, but there are good things happening. And to focus on how you can participate in those things is very helpful. I think that David and Cooperation Humboldt, I think the reason that they've had such a good relationship and work with the Wiyot tribe is because they really have showed up and they did it in a good way, not like, coming in and saying, oh, I'm the movement specialist in this, therefore this is how you're going to do it. They have come and shown that real solidarity with the work that we were doing, and asked, hey, with open arms, how can I help? Rolling up their sleeves and getting in to help. And I just want to say too that the Tula Island was 150 years worth of work that went into that, and several generations. And it was a struggle that I just happened to be alive when it happened. Like when it culminated into something real, I just happened to be here right now. But we don't always know when you're planting the seeds what the next generation is going to take. So don't get disheartened. Know that if you're doing things in a good way, that's what you need to do, is just show up and do your work in a good way, and good things will come of it.
Thank you, Michelle, for that. That was very very beautiful. This is for sure an emotional sort of, like we're all trying to do things better, in all that. I think one of the things I learned is all I can do. Sometimes you want to say you want to change the world like overnight or within my lifetime, and you just got to recognize, like, as a part of this, in terms of my trajectory, is that I'm only here for a certain amount of time, and all I can do is what I can within the context, and just to try to do it in a good way, and hopefully it works out. So thank you so much for reminding us about that. I'm going to go with a question from Roa and Lewis. I'm sorry, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your names.
No, but Lewis isn't going to talk. I'm going to talk, and that's pretty usual. So I'm Ruth Swennerfeld. I live on the unceded land of the Abenaki in Vermont. And this is a perfect segue from Michelle, as she spoke about how difficult it can be and how depressed or angry we can get so easily. Many, many decades ago, Dorothy Day, who was the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement around New York, they had farms in upstate New York that grew the food to feed the hungry in New York City. And they cared and loved. It was all with love. And she said the way that we're going to change society is that we create a new society in the shell of the old. And as that new society grows, it displaces the old one. And I really feel like being here and listening to all of you and all the people that have shown up and all the people in the chat, that we are creating that new society. And that is giving me hope. And so I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you so much for that comment. This reminds me of a book that I was handed by an elder in one of our communities. He's one of the former Chicano artists who passed away a couple of years ago. I forget his last name, but his name's Jose. And he gave me a book that was called Information, but as a double entendre, right? Like, it's just not just information that we're handing to you, but we're actually in formation. We're forming the new thing, and that's what this, and hopefully a lot of this information that we're producing and that we're discussing today is a part of this, transformation that that our panelists and all of y'all were sort of discussing. I'll hand it over to the panelists. Any last comments or thoughts that y'all want to sort of just leave this panel with? Thank you very much for holding space and giving us your time, and for the participants for sticking around for this conversation, even though technically we're supposed to end like a minute ago, and we're still here. Hopefully this has been really affirming for everybody. And who wants to go first? Anybody? I'm not going to try to dictate this.
Okay, I'll go real quick. I just wanted to thank everybody for allowing me to participate. It was really wonderful to hear everybody's voices. I'm really inspired by the work that everyone's doing. The last comment about building society in the shell of the new, I also really believe in that. But I also think it involves contestations around power and around resources. But I think the way to do that is to build what we, I see you chuckling, so I'm with that. Build what we build in such a way that provokes a crisis, that provokes the contradiction, as opposed to the contradiction always being imposed upon us. So I like to use the cordyceps fungi. I like to think of it as like a cordyceps strategy. So if you don't know what cordyceps fungi are, you can look them up. But I think we should be actually like building and growing inside the system to change its trajectory towards something that can actually and commandeer the resources, change its direction and purpose, and then propagate out as far and wide as we can for the greatest amount of equity, justice, democracy, and liberation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Gopal. Anna, David, Michelle, who wants to go next?
I just want to say that I really believe in us, and that we are the ones we have been waiting for. So don't get discouraged, take heart, and let's work together to change it all.
Thank you, Anna.
I'm going to jump in so that Michelle can have the last word. And I want to say out loud, because I'm not embarrassed to say it, Michelle, you made me cry again, which you often do, especially when I think about Tuluwat and how long that was, and that you have educated me on what that struggle was, and how grateful that I was that I got to be a witness to it and play ever so slight a role in doing that. And the other thing that I wanted to say is just such deep gratitude, not only to the panelists, because we got to be in conversation together, but also all of you who were mostly watching us in fishbowl, right? And so just being here, I am so deeply and sincerely grateful to you, and that you're on this earth with us in this moment. And the very last thing that I want to say is to harken back to a phrase that was tossed about during the civil rights struggle. And that is, just get in where you fit in, right? Like there's just so much work that should and needs to be done. And I really sincerely believe that if it's done in the right way, that good things will ultimately come from it. And I don't have to impose a linear, logical thing all the time, because if I'm doing the right thing, then good things will come, whether I'm there to witness it or not.
Cool. Thank you, David. And before I go to Michelle for the last word, I just want to like say my little piece that I want to add to David's comment. And if for those of you who have been in the movement and are already in, like, create space and make space for others to join, and just, and recognize sort of differences. And if somebody's trying to fit in, like, let's help them fit in. There's a lot of people who are hungry, a lot of young people who want to create change but don't know where to start. So let's make space for that. Michelle, we'll go for you for the last word.
Hopefully my internet works.
You're good.
I just want to say, with the island, like I said a few minutes ago, it was 150 years of work, and it was intergenerational. And I really feel like change started happening in our community by making that space. One of our former tribal chairwoman, Cheryl Seidner, and her sister, Leona Wilkinson, started vigils on Woodley Island, which overlooked Tuluwat. Remember that it was illegal at that time for Wiyot people to be on the island itself. So we had to hold these vigils at Woodley Island. But at those vigils, people came out, and it wasn't just Wiyot people. It wasn't just Native American people that were from other tribes in our area, or just, other tribal people, but they were just regular people that lived in our community that knew the history, or that, it was kind of a quiet history, but it was a known history. People didn't like to talk about it. It was ugly. Genocide is horrific. Murder is horrific. But at these vigils, these candlelight vigils, people came out, and those people that came out ended up being the movement that changed this place. Eureka, which was, once known as Murderville, who got pressed for this horrific, murderous act of attacking people in the middle of ceremony, in the middle of night, in their sleep. This horrible thing that had happened in this legacy that was left behind was quiet, and it was ugly, and nobody wanted to look at it. And these vigils helped people to look at it quietly by candlelight. A movement formed around that space, and those same people are the ones who came forward when it was time to do fundraisers to buy pieces of land back, to do the work to restore a place that was environmentally destroyed. It was those same people that came out, and it really made change in our community by doing labor together, elbow to elbow in the dirt. You really you get to know people, you form relationships, and that is real. That is where I believe that place-based healing comes into effect, and people can change their community. And so we went from being Murderville, making worldwide headlines for this horrendous activity, to a place that was the first municipal government in the United States to ever give back land to a tribe without being legally forced to do so. And that came because of those relationships that developed over time by holding space and people showing up.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that. Thank you very much, everybody, for your participation and for all the awesome work that y'all are doing in your own communities. And hopefully y'all can keep it up and we can grow it. And we're hopefully, like Gopal said, we're already in it. We bear fruit, and we can sort of support more of it. Thank you so much, everybody. Y'all have a good day, good weekend, and keep at it.